Okay, perfect. It says the broadcast is live.
Yeah. Welcome, everyone.
All right. So today, let's see. Okay, so we are talking about forgiveness today, which is going to be something that is quite exciting. I'm very, very fascinated in this particular subject, and I think we're going to take this one a little deeper than normal. And we're going to really discuss the bones of what forgiveness is, what it does, how we can start it if we haven't already, and how do we truly know that we have forgiven somebody. This is kind of like the question, right? Yesterday I posed it to Michelle. I'm like, how do we know that we truly forgave somebody, or are we just a tad bit like, oh yeah, I forgive you, and then we keep holding on to that stuff until it's comes up at a later time. So we're going to be talking about forgiveness. What is it? So I guess the first thing we're going to ask is, Michelle, what is it? What is forgiveness?
Forgiveness is actually, in my opinion, nothing about the other person. When we go through trauma and events and that, there's always an emotional content where we allow that to integrate into us. And we need to forgive ourselves for allowing that to control us or take over or to run a programming that has been going on for years and years and years. That's where forgiveness comes in. Forgiving them automatically happens as we release the emotions that come with it. But we don't actually have to really work on forgiving them for what they've done, because the universe and everything else is going to take care of that for us. Because karma is neutral. You do something bad, it's something bad's going to happen to you. You do something good, something's good's going to happen for you.
Well, and isn't that interesting? Sherry, what is your take on what forgiveness is?
Hmm. Forgiveness is just releasing the negative emotions attached to what someone did, and also just forgiving. For me, it's forgiving the act, but not necessarily forgetting it. Um, and it's a process to me.
Well, and this is what we're going to be discussing today because, there's lots of questions sometimes. And I mean, honestly, to me, forgiveness is a peace of mind. Like, when we start having things that whether it's we're holding grudges or, not trusting people, it really happens to take away our peace of mind. It keeps us in turmoil. And what we're really after is that kind of that peace of mind where we can feel safe, secure, and healthy. And so getting to there can be challenging because we've all had trauma in our life in one form or another. I don't think anybody's escaped it. Some really horrific, others not so much, but still it works away at our self esteem and our self confidence. So, how do we start this forgiveness process with ourselves? Sherry, what is that to you? How do we start?
I think first of all, we have to recognize there's a problem. Um, Sometimes we just have these triggers and we're on autopilot so often we don't even recognize it. We just go to that emotion and, usually it's anger or jealousy or bitterness that comes up. Or if we think of a certain person, things come to mind, what they did. Like if you have a long laundry list of what that person did to you, you probably need to work on letting that go. And it's because otherwise it's kind of like drinking poison yourself, expecting the person you don't like or upset with to get sick from it?
Mhm.
Well, definitely. And so, Michelle, what are some of the steps that we can start taking? Okay, so we recognize that there's an issue. That's the first step that I think we can all agree on. Like, okay, I'm not very happy. So, what do I do to get my happiness back? And how do I know whether or not I need to forgive? What is the next step? So, there's a problem, but how do I know it's me?
Well, the way you know it's you is that it's your life, right? If things are not working out within your life, it's you, it's not anybody else. So we need to work on some of the steps that I've been through. is that once I realize that, oh, I have this negative emotion that's been kind of floating around, it's from this time period, I'll go back to like that time period and really look at look at what chakra was developing at that time. Because our chakras, the first like birth to 7 years, we're developing our security on earth. And if we've had things that happened during that time period, our security and how we feel about this earth and our life and that stuff gets shaken up all the time. And so we really need to go back to that chakra and start working on the beginning of that chakra and healing that chakra. And as we do that, the emotions come up and then we can be able to release them, and everything comes in patterns. You can always see it in your patterns. Like if something is happening again and again and again, even if it's 2, 3, 5 years apart, it's still a pattern that needs to be addressed.
Okay, so now this is kind of a critical point, because sometimes we don't recognize when a pattern is starting to occur again. Let's say the event has happened 2 or 3 times or more, and then all of a sudden, we start having it again. One of the troubles that we have often is that we rely on our hindsight to teach us. So how can we start seeing that pattern before literally before it starts emerging as a pattern? What are some of the recognizable steps that we can take when we can understand that here it comes again? Sherry, what do you think about that?
I think you really need to be in tune with yourself, and that comes through prayer or meditation time, like a spiritual practice that you do daily, because that's going to give you that more of an awareness faster. Whereas otherwise you're right, it's going to be hindsight 2020 again, and then you're like, dang it, I did it again, or I let it happen again. You have to really recognize, if you go back to that situation, like let's just isolate it for a moment. If somebody wronged you, if you go back to that moment and really think about, kind of like what Michelle said, the emotions come up. If you do that, and then you can kind of recognize what emotions were present during that time, and then you can kind of figure out what's triggering them in the present and maybe start being more aware of them. But if you're not in a spiritual practice of meditation or checking in with yourself regularly, like that heart space, like Michelle talked about last week, I don't think you're going to really get anywhere until you're willing to face yourself in that way.
Well, and isn't that a powerful step? Because, Michelle, how do we, there's this fine line that we all kind of get into, right? This deniability. And then we're like, because that's what creates oh man, it happened again. But let's use the example of housework, okay? I don't know about you guys, but I don't really care for housework. I know it needs to be done, but when I start preparing to do housework, like it's like this whole process, right? You got to talk yourself into it and build yourself up like, oh, it's only going to last a minute, Now, okay, I'm being a little exaggerated, but for the purpose of this, Michelle, what happens in this process? Because would you say that we recognize the thoughts that are coming through when we start having an experience?
Sometimes we don't recognize those thoughts until after we've decided to start taking responsibility for what has been creating. And I think that's the key thing to even starting the process of forgiveness and working through everything, is that we need to remember that we need to take responsibility for how we've allowed something to control us or to manipulate the universe against us in order to have, for that. And so as soon as we decide, hey, nobody's coming to save me, I got to save myself and take responsibility, everything starts to change and we start to see things a lot differently.
Well, and I think that's important, because it is about us being willing to take the responsibility for what we've created and what we're going to continue to create. because, you know, it is like recognizing that. That's how I think it's a good step when we're owning our crap, when we're owning our thought pattern, when we're owning all of that responsibility of that. I think it's a great way to be able to determine like how you can proceed. Now, when we start into the forgiveness stuff, let's okay, so we've recognized that there's a problem. We are now seeing the pattern come up because we're taking responsibility for our thoughts and actions. So now, how do we proceed forward on going into this forgiveness? Like, is there a script we can follow? Is, you know, I mean, each situation is, of course, unique, but for the most part, there's got to be a general process that we can start that will help launch this forgiveness. So let's talk about the general process of how do we start forgiving ourselves? And Michelle, why don't you go ahead and start? How do we start forgiving ourselves?
Well, we need to kind of first of all recognize the pattern. We need to go inside and check in with ourselves and kind of realize, okay, what age did this happen? And, you know, because sometimes we're playing up a program from like the inner child from our childhood. And we need to work on actually forgiving the inner child and letting them know that it wasn't their fault and that they are safe. Because a lot of times these programs also happen when the inner child is like, I don't feel safe. I need to control the situation. Well, when we over control, other things can happen. And so we just kind of like do this little spiral thing as we move through with this word control and inner child. And so a lot of it is, you know, the inner child. You know, we got to reconnect with that inner child. The inner child is all about unconditional love, joy, and happiness. You know, and then we may need to look at, you know, did some of the things happen when we were teenagers? You know, that teenage self is that spontaneous, rule breaking, testing the limits person. And both of them need to happen in order for us to become adults. Because we know that if we can bring forward the love, unconditional love, happiness, and joy, and we can be spontaneous, yet know our boundaries and yet push our boundaries, we're able to grow into the adult that we need to be. And so forgiveness is all about really going back and working on what time period again that we need to work on with either our inner child or the inner teenager.
Interesting. So these programs that we get started, I think all of us can agree that these are learned behaviors, learned programs, that kind of stuff. So Sherry, what is some of let's talk about some of the programs that we get running that keep us from forgiving. What are some of the programs that we would be running to keep us from forgiving?
I guess I'm not real familiar with what you're calling programming. Um, like maybe it's the same word as schemas.
It'd be
I
like
think
a
that,
self-pity program or that kind of.
okay, you know, that is true because if, as long as we can stay in self-pity and why does this always happen to me and how dare they do this to me, that's victimization and it's stinking thinking. And it also takes all the responsibilities off of your shoulders. And I think also, you know, like if you feel like the world is not a safe place, because like what Michelle was talking about, if you can trace it back to your chakra from like birth to 7 years or teenage years or even young adult years, whatever. I love, so like Erik Erikson, you know, his 8 stages or whatever of life. I kind of relate to that because in every stage of life and in every development of chakras, you know, you have these programs that do come up like what you're talking about. If I'm safe, if I'm not, then, you know, that kind of puts you in a victim state of mind. Does that answer the question or did I just talk in a circle? I'm not sure.
No, you did good because it kind of elaborates because it's these programs when we are having them, they really do keep us in that one mode that allows us to stay there. Now let's talk about the programming of blame. This is something that we're taught at a very early age to blame, right? We blame so and so for driving weird, or, so and so for doing this, or so and so for doing that. At what age do we stop blaming other people for what happened to us at a certain age? You know what I mean? Like at 18, legally, we are an adult, right? So at 18, do we just now take responsibility that there is no more blame? At the age of 18, do we no longer blame anybody for anything that happens to us because now we're deemed an adult and that's the way it is? Michelle, what are your thoughts on that?
So that's an interesting, because when my kids both turned 18, they got the birthday card from me going, "Congratulations, you're now an adult. What happens in your life from this on out is your fault, not mine."
Well, because it's like, I mean, this is part of it. Is it's like learning to stop blaming, and at what age do you take responsibility? I mean, honestly. So let's talk about like this particular thing, because this seems to hink up like a lot of people. They're always like, when I was 4, my parents did this. When I was 8, family did this. When I was 20, they did this, and my employer did this. At what age do we really start taking the responsibility for ourselves? At what age is it appropriate? Is it legally 18? Is that when we're responsible? What do you think?
No.
So what age do you think we should start taking responsibility?
So on the spiritual end, it's actually age 8. Because age 8 is when you are working on your second chakra and your second chakra at the same time. So your second chakra is all about the sense of who you are, your connection to source, everything else. So that is the year. And if we look back in like Catholicism, Judaism, they all have that age 8 as a major milestone. There's a few other ones out there too. Baptism has age 8 as a major milestone. Age 8 is that age where they're no longer a child, but they're able to start logically making those decisions a little bit more and being able to take responsibility for their actions a little bit more than like a 4 or 5-year-old would be able to. And so with that, it's kind of like their adult and training years. And we need to look at it like that. Like your apron strings need to be cut with your child around age 8. They need to have that sense of, I get to go out and explore my world, fall down, break a bone, and know somebody's going to be there for me.
I agree with that. Sherry, what do you think about how do we? This is okay. So at age 8 is when we should take responsibility. So how do we learn how to take responsibility? What are some key steps that, maybe there's some people out there that are struggling on, like, how do I teach responsibility without being domineering or brainwashing my child? Because this seems to be, where a lot of it can come from, like, I didn't embarrass you. You let yourself get embarrassed. When
Right.
dang well the parent is telling stories to purposely embarrass the child. And so, how do we teach responsibility without that kind of, structure, to make sure that we're teaching it right? What do you think?
I think you need to take your ego out of the equation, and realize that your children, they're not always a reflection of you, like their behavior. If you're doing your best to teach them to have critical thinking skills, and what I did is I role played with my girls a lot. For instance, because we're talking about forgiveness, I'm going to bring this up. So when I had to forgive my stepfather from a lot of the abuse, okay, I really had to think through that. But I was stuck. And I think the reason I was stuck is because my mom always told me, don't put yourself in a situation where, you can get raped or you can get hurt or whatever with boys and all these things. But I never was given the tools to say no, to learn to stand up for myself necessarily. I was told whatever it takes. Well, what does that mean to like a 7 and 8-year-old, and older? So I was really adamant on doing role playing with my girls. Like, what if this happens and what if that happens? And then they had to think about why they reacted the way they did and where that comes from. And I think that was helpful. They still got in situations, of course, we all do. But if you give your kids the critical skill set that they need, like the skill set of critical thinking and how to think things through, they're going to be able to get over that blame game. They're going to be able to get over the self-pity because they're going to know they have the skills to take responsibility and go out there on their own.
I think that's a great answer. Okay, so let's jump ahead a few little bit because I'm going to bring this example in because not, and unfortunately sometimes children don't get taught, right? So I'm going to give this example. When I was working at a medical clinic, there was a child that come in, and I say child, to see the doctor. And it was his first time as an adult. So of course we needed new paperwork. And I handed him the paper and everything like that. I'm like, I need you to fill this out. And he sat over there for like 10 minutes. And I'm like, are you struggling? And he's like, yeah, my mom usually does all of this. I don't know how to, I don't know what you need. Even though, of course, it's clearly like name, age, birthday, it's clearly marked out. But this was a child who was like, this form is completely overwhelming to me. I have no idea what to do. Now, of course, knowing what I know now and I look back on that situation, of course, I look at that kid and I'm thinking, wow, he just went through abandonment, betrayal, how could you leave me? I don't know anything. I'm, just floundering. So let's talk a little bit about that particular age. Let's say a child is just learning because they were never taught. What are some key steps that they can take to learn these tools, how to critically think for themselves so that they can start taking responsibility for their actions? Michelle, what are your thoughts? What are some things they can do?
Well, to learn to critical think is a really interesting concept because, as we know right now in school, they're not teaching it. And so it is really up to the parents to teach their kids how to critically think. And basically what I did with my kids is that I'd be like, okay, so this is the situation. How would you handle it? Kind of the role playing thing like Sherry was talking about earlier. And we would just talk through, and like when every single time we would go to the doctor's office, if it was a new clinic, I would have them watch me fill up the forms. So that way, when they moved out on their own or whatever, they were able to start doing that on their own. And then it was like when they were 16, if they needed a doctor's appointment, I would look at them and go, call up and make it. You have your card. You have the number. Just let me know the date and time so I can get you there. And so it's like they were able to start making those decisions for their life and what they needed to take care of themselves before they even left home at age 18 or after high school. So that way they had those skills. And I think it's all about just us reaffirming and walking them through the steps and being there for them.
Well, and I think that is important. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump a couple more years to a person that we are now having to deal with that does not know how to take responsibility. And I'm going to give the example of a work environment. Okay, person comes up to you and you're like, why haven't you done this? And they're like, well, nobody told me. Okay, so let's talk about that for a minute. Nobody told me. Is that a cop-out or is it a truth? Sherry, what are your thoughts on that?
I think it depends on the situation. If it's in the job description that they agreed to, that is a cop-out somewhat. Sometimes it's inadequate training. But I always ask him, like if I have a friendship built up a little bit with him, I pull him aside and I said, we're being paid by the hour, so we need to stay busy. What can you do, like looking around, that you can do without getting in big trouble? to make your day more productive. I know I've worked in office environments and as well as nursing. But in nursing, you have a list of stuff you're supposed to do, and your scope of knowledge and ability, and you're supposed to work within that frame of reference. But if it's a new person, I mean, obviously they might not have enough training. So I would just ask them, do you need to talk to your supervisor or have us help you train more or whatever? I think if you get to the bottom of that thinking, then you kind of know how to move forward with that person.
Well, and okay, so let's take this a little bit further. Let's say the person comes up to you and you're like, why aren't you doing something? And they're like, well, nobody told me. Well, let's fast forward. So, let's pretend that we have given them the re-education, okay, on whatever. And let's say that we're sitting there and somebody else asks them the same question about the same incident, and they say, well, nobody told me. What do we do then? I mean, because it's like we want this person to be responsible, but obviously they haven't been taught how to take responsibility, or they have been taught how to pass the buck. So when it comes to our personal responsibility for healing and taking responsibility, when we have somebody that is using this, even though we know they have been told, they've been taught, and they've been all these things, how do we get them to recognize without, I mean, like honestly, publicly humiliating them? How do we get them to be like, seriously, did I not just do that with you? Michelle, what are your thoughts on a person who keeps going back to that as their go-to?
Well, you kind of have to look at, like, why do they keep on going back? Like, what has been the programming? Because if they keep on going back to something, that's kind of telling me that they're stuck at that time period or at that age or whatever, that development for that mind and body, that it just hasn't been able to move forward yet. I mean, so there's a lot of that going on. I'm like, even with our young adults right now, if you look at it, they're all going back to this frustration, anger. Everyone needs to be the same. Everyone needs to be doing the same, because that's what they were taught in school with all these group projects and everything, that if you don't do your group project and do it as the rest of the group is doing it, then we all fail and we're all going to be mad at you, which is social conditioning. And so their social conditioning may be different than ours, because most of us were the first generation where we were not raised with parents in the household. And so we had to think for ourselves. We had to figure things out on our own early on.
Well, and I find it, so when we're working through this, like it's about understanding every age group and that kind of stuff. But when we're taking this aspect into the forgiveness, when a person is stuck and we can see it and they kind of keep going back to that, well, nobody ever told me. Well, nobody ever told me. At what year and at what time frame do we say, you know what, that's no longer a valid excuse? What is, because it's like we've all dealt with people, whether it's coworkers, parents, children, siblings, even ourselves. Like, what age do I tell myself, Althea, saying nobody ever told me isn't going to work anymore? When I'm starting to work through these issues, like, this is how do we get through this to recognize that, like, those excuses aren't going to work anymore. They're not going to cut the mustard. They're not going to help us. And how do we help ourselves to get out of that nobody ever told me mindset? Michelle, what are your thoughts on that?
So my thought on that there is that as soon as you want a different life is when you need to let go of that concept. Because there's a lot of us that weren't told a lot of things. I mean, come on, women. How many of you guys were talked about your monthly period? And yet it still happened.
Right.
So, and we had to figure it out. I mean, and that was generations on past. Like, that was something that was just never talked about. It just happened, never talked about, and you just knew you had to figure it out. And so I think that time period happens and comes when we decide we want a different life.
I think it is important. I think it really is important because I think even people that use that as their excuse at some point, they're like, I'm really tired of everybody telling me, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Because you know as well as I do, when people say, oh, well, nobody ever told me, then we feel very obligated to tell that person. And so at some point, they're going to be like, you know what? I'm so tired of everybody telling me, you know? And so with this, like, we recognize that there's a problem. We recognize that we're uneasy about stuff. We recognize that we're not sleeping well. We recognize that, you know, there is some stuff that we need to work through. So now we're taking responsibility. So, in taking responsibility for ourselves, what is some gentle ways that we can start taking the responsibility for ourselves? Sherry, what do you think of that?
For me, I'm a list maker. And when I hit these walls, I think to myself, what do I have direct control of? And I'm not talking about the big stuff. You know, every day you get up, you shower, you eat, you get yourself wherever you need to go. Um, so those are all things that kind of build that not confidence. It reinforces that you do have some control in your life daily, and I think for me, writing down like the most 6 or 7 most important things to do the next day kind of gives you that responsibility of what you have to do tomorrow. It's just little things that you can, you know, do and make sure that they're attainable, that they are things that you can kind of snowball into bigger things, if that makes sense. Um, but yeah, you have to sometimes, being a mom especially, that's an easy one that everyone can relate to. It's just like, if I don't do it, who's going to? And realizing I don't want to live in a filthy mess, or I don't want to keep doing this. And that's when yeah, like kind of like what you said earlier, when you recognize you don't want to you want better for yourself. I think you have to kind of take those little tiny steps towards it that are in your grasp.
Well, and let's talk about self-criticism because this is like the next thing that we kind of start into when we're working through forgiveness. We kind of get hard on ourselves about, like, why didn't we do this sooner? Why didn't this, you know, kind of thing? We kind of go through a blame. We kind of go through all of that, and while we're recognizing what we need to do to change. So Michelle, how do we start getting this into maybe some time frame? That how do we start scheduling some time to start working through it? How do we take care of ourselves that way?
Well, I look at it this way. If we would have known about it earlier, we would have started it earlier. You can't start or change anything until you recognize it and become aware of it. And so when we realize that things need to change and we need to start on creating that new life or whatever it is that we want, we really need to start working on from that moment forward. What can I do daily to change this mind concept, to change my body image, whatever it is? We need to just start from that moment forward. We cannot be mad at ourselves, angry at ourselves, frustrated at ourselves for not changing it earlier on because we weren't aware of it then. Some of these programs have become so deep and so ingrained, and so I call like the first like 7 years, it's kind of like you're playing Monopoly, and you know that card that says go straight to jail? Everything you hear, everything you see goes right into your psyche, into your soul, doesn't even go through that logical frontal lobe for you to decide whether or not you want it or not. It just goes right in there.
Interesting. Well, and I mean, so when we are starting this, like, and we are realizing, okay, my life has become painful. I don't want to do this anymore. Do we cut everybody out of our life that has ever wronged us? This is this is kind of a powerful question. but it is one that a lot of people want to know. We talk about cutting cords with unhealthy people. Well, if we've deemed everybody in our life kind of like the source of the problem as to why we are the way we are, our programming, our, everyday mannerisms, everything like that, do we cut them all out? Sherry, what are your thoughts on that?
I think it depends on who they are and how toxic they are. If they are truly like textbook narcissists, the best solution is no contact probably. If there's someone that just has a problem with boundaries, then you need to start beefing up those boundaries and really sticking to it. Um, if for instance, if you keep finding yourself with alcoholic tendencies and you keep going back to people that know you don't want to drink anymore, but they keep trying to force it on you, then yeah, those situations you should probably just totally avoid. I think you need to realize what's best for you and what's going to be the best for your peace to get through it until you can come out a little bit stronger.
I think that's interesting. Michelle, what are your thoughts on cutting ties with everybody?
So it depends on the situation, what all happened, how long it happened. Um, so there are a couple family members that I have totally cut ties with because of what happened in my childhood with them. I recognize that, a lot of the other stuff that happened is from other family members, but it all depends on the severity. If the other person recognizes it, also, I mean, that's a big thing. If the other person doesn't even recognize it to even want to make amends, why would you even want to have that person in your life?
Well, and that brings up a very interesting point because that is one of the steps in forgiveness is working to make amends. Like, when we want forgiveness of ourselves or whatever, and things are being called to our attention because sometimes we're the offenders. Sometimes we are the people who hurt other people. And so when we go to make amends for recognizing our part in their hardship, how do we make amends if they don't want to, what do we do there? Because this seems to be a big conflict. It's like, well, they wouldn't have talked to me anyway, so I just didn't do anything about it. How do we make amends if we are the offenders? How do we make amends so that we can get that forgiveness or at least go through that process for them to recognize, hey, I see that I messed up and I am really sorry that I did. I'm going to do my best not to do that again. What if they don't recognize that? Michelle, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, if they don't recognize that, then you just kind of like, as long as you open up that door, you have to wait for them to realize and be ready to go through that door. Because we can't force people to go through a door of
Right.
any kind. And so when they just need to know that, hey, this door is open. And when I'm ready, I get to walk through it. And then if, we're the problem, then we just need to have that open arms and just kind of like allow things to just move forward from that moment on, unless they want to talk about what happened. Because sometimes it's just all about starting a new relationship and moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Sherry, how would you go about approaching, when let's say that we're making the amends? What are some steps that we can do to kind of go through this process to make sure that we really have done everything we can do to make amends, to right our wrongs?
I think we don't get to say whether we hurt someone or not because it's, kind of a subjective thing. We just have to acknowledge their pain and acknowledge kind of why we did it, not as an excuse, but to recognize why we did it so that we don't hurt them again that way. I know for me, like sometimes I do that with my kids and it's really painful if I screw up. But sometimes I've had to call in archangels. Like I have like 4 of them that I work with. One removes blockages, one helps find forgiveness, one kind of helps with healing type of a thing. And that works for me. But if I didn't have that ability to stop and say, wow, I didn't realize that hurt you, I think that wouldn't really help much. I mean, without that ability to admit when you're wrong and ask for forgiveness.
Well, Yeah, because I think, I mean, when we're looking to heal ourselves, I mean, we're looking at all the aspects of it because, I mean, at times, we're not just the victim. Sometimes the victim becomes the offender. And it's like we all have different phases that we work through. So it's like, how do we get, well, I guess the best example I'm going to say, and I'm going to call it self righteousness because I don't know a more proper term for it. It's when we go through the process and we are like, okay, I finally healed from this. And then we sit there and tell other people that they're kind of a piece of crap for not asking us to forgive them or things like that. I've seen situations like that, usually within my own family, within small social circles, where the victim now becomes the offender and kind of gets in this self-righteous mode. How do we work through that, Michelle? What are your thoughts on that self-righteousness tendency?
Well, when we're in that self righteousness tendency, then we have actually swung the pendulum too far to the other side, and which actually does happen when we're starting to heal or work through anything. Like we're always on this pendulum. If we're in the abuse, maybe we're over here, we're in the poor pity me, and then we're like, okay, I'm going to take responsibility, I'm going to work on it, and we're going to swing it all the way over here, and I'm going to be self-righteous because this was not supposed to happen, and I'm going to start blaming everyone because it's now everyone else's fault that it happened because I'm better than this. And we just need to like always bring it back to the center in order for everything to equal out and for us to see both sides. Like Wayne Dyer said, like I can see clearly now, right? His book,
Yeah.
I Can See Clearly Now. It's all about after the fact, how he can now see things a lot clearer than when you're in the middle of it. So it's not until we're actually fully done with something that we can kind of look back and see through it all.
Well, and I just think it's very interesting because it's like, I think, like we talked about a couple of weeks ago, there are 7 stages of everything, it seems like. We go through the grief, the agony, the depression, the crying, the bargaining, and then finally the acceptance, of what is. And so, like, I think it's important that when people are working through and working on forgiveness, it's important to recognize not everybody's going to feel the same way that we do about it. And I think that is keeping it at the center because, like, you're no longer a victim, but you're not an offender either. And being able to recognize that, oh my gosh, okay, so I can still be loving. I don't have to be critical or harsh with other people that are going through the process. And just because somebody comes up to me and says, hey, I recognize I did this to you and I'm really, really sorry. And I say, thank you. Thank you for recognizing that meanness and thank you for apologizing. Like that helps a lot. And, but I don't have to interact with you ever again. You know what I mean? Like you still get the
Mm-hmm.
choice of whether or not you're going to interact with that person. And so it's those kind of steps that we take in this forgiveness process that allows us the freedom to really experience the full benefits of forgiveness because what we're really after is that peace of mind that we do not have that promotes us and propels us to be searching, seeking, and finding and discovering and repairing till we can get that peace of mind. So I think this I think this discussion is very, very important. What are some other things, Michelle, that you feel just are important that we haven't touched on today about the forgiveness? What are your thoughts on that?
One of the things that happens with forgiveness is actually learning to fully love yourself. And it's just something that automatically happens because when we are stuck in that poor pity me, my life, childhood sucked, all this negative drama, when we start to go through and we start to do the healing, we start to do the forgiveness, we actually start to learn who we really are, what we're about, which then we can go, oh, wow, I can actually start loving myself.
Well, and I think that's important. Sherry, what about you? What are some things that maybe you think about forgiveness that we haven't talked about today?
I think a point more than anything is when it depends on who we've wronged. If we've wronged a male, their need, I mean, it's like their oxygen, line is respect. And so chances are when we have hurt a man, we have, not shown them the respect that they felt was due or that they needed to feel like they were valued. With a woman, it feels like if you weren't very loving, if you did something unloving towards them, I think you need to look at what that human need is so that you can start to kind of change that and change how you approach them. Also, if you ask them, what can I do going forward in the future to kind of show that I'm serious, or that this doesn't happen again? What would that look like for you? And then just have that dialogue, maybe as uncomfortable as it would be,
I think these are both very, very valid points, because learning to love yourself through the process, and then learning how, like, what it means to other people, like having those dialogues not only with ourselves but with other people, so we can find out, like, how we can coexist in this great big planet, because obviously we're not going to be alone, or it is not. There's 7 billion or plus people on this earth at all times. So we're never going to be alone, but it's learning how to love ourselves and love others and respect where they're at too. Like, not everybody's where we are at. And some people are a long ways from hitting that point, and other people just flat out don't want to do it. And then there's those people that are so excited to do it that you're like, I got to question their sincerity. You know what I mean? Like, do they really want to do it, or are they just saying it to be because they are pleasers? Uh, that's kind of something that I want to be able to kind of talk about for just a few minutes before we have to kind of wrap the ones that are just pleasers. Michelle, what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so you cut out.
Oh.
So would you like to repeat that?
Okay. So our thought is like, I want to talk a little bit about these people who are just so willing to jump into this and do it and do the work and everything like that, but it's really just to please. It's really just to do that kind of stuff. How do we work with those people with is it sincere? Is it not sincere? How do we work through that so that we can further assist ourselves literally through the forgiveness program?
So, to verify, how do we work with people who are just willing to say anything to please us?
Yes.
Okay. I don't.
Interesting.
If they're just going to do whatever it is to just say yes or no just to please you, then they don't have their own boundaries within themselves to even know what is going on, and they're not even ready for the talk to go through things with you or anything like that.
Interesting. Sherry, what are your thoughts about that? Sincere, insincere, too willing, not willing enough?
If you, once again, it goes back to those spiritual practices. If you're tuned in to yourself and your higher self, you're going to pick up very quickly, especially if you're an empath. If you're being lied to, or just kind of, it's a big put on. I know my husband is a Libra, and he will do anything to avoid confrontation. And so I've had to really think back on my history with him. Okay, what things similar to this have really ticked him off? And then that's how I kind of recognize if he's just trying to get along with me, or if he's probably still hurt and doesn't want to admit it, because then there's further conflict. I don't know. I guess I just trust my gut. And if I tell him, okay, if you say this is okay, I'm going to trust it is. And it's on you if it's not, because you weren't honest with me. Because I'm not, I tend to take on responsibility for other people, and I feel bad when I shouldn't. So recognize what, like, if you've been abused by somebody, recognize what kind of shame you're carrying, because it might not belong to you. It might be that person's. It should belong to them and not you. and I guess just have to put it down at the end of the day and walk away from it if you can.
Well, and I think that point right there, that learning to just put it down because it's not ours to carry anymore, like we have to, in the forgiveness process, we can only do so much to heal ourselves through each event. And then at what point do we finally decide, or can we decide, you know what, I think I've done everything I can, and I just, how do I stop worrying about it? How do I stop literally and put it down? Michelle, what are your thoughts on that? I've done all I can do. Now, how do I just literally just drop it and be done with it?
Well, if you've done all that you can do, I like what Sherry says. Like, you really need to look at, like, is this yours or is it theirs? And if you've done all that you can do, there's no sense hanging on to it because it's not yours.
Well, and I find that just very interesting. You know what I mean? So, as we wrap up, as we wrap up this hour of kind of forgiveness, Michelle, I would like some last minute thoughts on what forgiveness has done for you. What benefits have you received from doing forgiveness work?
The forgiveness on doing the work for myself has actually freed me up a lot. I'm really not really concerned about what my birth family thinks of me, what they want from me. I'm just like, nope, I'm going to do my own thing. I'm going to be me, and the right people will be there for me.
Very good. And Sherry, what about you?
I have learned to love others unconditionally. And when I forgave myself, for instance, for doing things that didn't honor me to myself, it made me look at other people with more compassion and more empathy. And it's easier to be slower to anger and to bitterness because I realize they're probably just a couple slobs like I was doing the best they can, and God help them because we all need it.
I think that is very, very true. So I think in forgiveness, I mean, again, if you're watching this and you're like, okay, where do I start? Like, one is recognizing that you're ready to do something different. We all agree, that until you get to the point where you're like, okay, I am really frustrated with what's going on and I don't want to feel this way anymore. That's when it really starts. That's when any of the emotional wellness starts. That's when you start working on your dark side. That's when you start working on your light side. That's when you start working on all of it. But you really have to get to the point where you decide, I don't want to do this anymore. So then the next step is recognizing that you can do something about it. You're not helpless. You're not helpless to change your path. You're not helpless to change your life. And you're not helpless to just sit there and flounder. There are plenty of people who are willing to help guide and direct and also, be there for you during the process. We all call it our mastermind group or our group of friends, our go to. Preferably stay away from your fight friends when you're doing forgiveness work because you need a group that is supportive. You need a group that is understanding, and you need people that are willing to kind of explain as you hit the different levels of forgiveness. Everybody goes through them differently. Some of them try to jump ahead and end up coming back to the basic ones. So recognize, understand that it's going to take some time, recognize that it's going to be sometimes painful, but it doesn't have to be. You have a choice, just like you can choose not to be offended anymore. So Michelle is here. You can reach out to her. Sherry is here. You can reach out to her. I'm here. You can reach out to me. All of us are willing to help. And we all have based our practices on helping people through things because we know how difficult it is sometimes to feel alone. So, with that, I hope that you enjoyed the day's session. I hope that this has been informative, and I hope that you guys will continue watching us as we go through many other different topics. If you have one that you would like us to discuss, or maybe would like some more input, make sure you leave it in the comments. Make sure you're posting your comments so we can get your feedback too. And as always, thanks for joining us today. Ladies, thank you.
Thank you.